One thing I must say is that there's no such thing as a perfect ship. I would hate to be in a situation where you've got 7,000 people that have got to be evacuated from one of these big ships in bad weather. Absolutely.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise Podcast.
In this episode, we're going to be speaking to our friend Dr Stephen Payne, the naval architect behind the most iconic ocean liner of our time, Queen Mary II. Dr Payne's distinguished career in naval architecture is marked by numerous achievements, but none as significant as the design and creation of Queen Mary II. Launched in 2004, Queen Mary II is not just a ship, it's a floating masterpiece, blending classic ocean liner elegance with cutting-edge technology. As the longest, tallest and the most expensive ocean liner ever constructed, it continues to capture the imagination of maritime enthusiasts around the world. Stephen, welcome. Let's start from the beginning. What inspired you to become a naval architect? It's not your everyday job.
Well, I distinctly remember coming home from school, switching on the television, and in those days we only had grainy black and white television, and watching Blue Peter, which was something that us youngsters did before internet and Wi-Fi and everything else. And there was always something interesting on Blue Peter, but on this particular occasion, Barry Singleton, one of the presenters, she went to Cherbourg and boarded the Cunard liner Queen Elizabeth that was on its way back from New York, stopped off at Cherbourg, and then it was the short couple of hour trip back to Southampton. And during that time, she visited the bridge, the engine room, public areas, cabins, and I was absolutely fascinated by this. It absolutely captured my imagination. And although the term hadn't been invented then, it's only subsequent, but when I give this explanation to youngsters, I use the word, it looks so cool, because we never used the word cool in those days. But that's what it was to me. It really captured my imagination. And in fact, I've been able to look back into the BBC archives to find that that was broadcast on the 23rd of May, 1965. So I was 5 years old when I saw that. And from then on, I was telling everybody when I grow up, I'm going to design and build something bigger and better than the Queen Elizabeth.
So how did Queen Mary II come about?
Well, Cunard was in a fairly rough shape in the mid-90s. Chronic underinvestment. It was owned by a British conglomerate called Trafalgar House. Trafalgar House had been bought by an Anglo-Norwegian company, Caverna, and they only wanted the construction business, which made Trafalgar House his most money. They didn't want Cunard, weren't interested in it. So they put Cunard up for sale, and nobody wanted it because there was this ageing ship, the QE2, and a few other rather mismatched ships that didn't coordinate with her. So it was really seen as a sort of lame duck. And then James Cameron did his film Titanic. And of course it's a North Atlantic story, passengers standing on the North Atlantic, or crossing the North Atlantic. And suddenly there was an upsurge in bookings for the QE2. And I can only imagine everybody wanted to do this. And it's because of that Caverna then put the company back on the market, and Carnival then saw an opportunity. Mickey Harrison said, right, if we take Cunard, get it for a reasonable price, you've got the legacy of the Cunard heritage, and we'll see if we can build a new ship to take over from QE2. And that was how Queen Mary II began.
Someone that's not into cruising might find it quite incredible that a film based on a ship sinking triggers an upsurge in cruise bookings. If you had a film about a plane crash, I can't imagine that's going to lead to a massive surge in flight bookings. But so you said about Cunard's heritage. The original Queen Mary is still with us. She's now in Long Beach, California. How does Queen Mary 2 compare to the original Queen Mary in terms of size, capabilities and luxury?
It's really chalk and cheese because so much has happened. You know, she was designed in the early 1930s. Queen Mary 2 was designed around 2000. So there's, 70 odd years there. And the ship, first of all, is twice as large. The volume is twice as big. We have full air conditioning, which the old Queen didn't have. Every cabin has ensuite facilities and the like. We use a fraction of the power that the old Queen used for her 29, 30 knots. And we can more or less match that. The top speed of Queen Mary 2 is 29.6 knots. But we use significantly less power because hydrodynamics has moved on. So there's a whole string of advances. The old Queen Mary, the sewage used to be pumped straight overboard and the like. Obviously we don't do that. It's in a controlled way now. And we've got scrubbers that clean the exhaust and things like that. So there's a myriad of things that make the ships completely different. And from a seakeeping point of view, when Queen Mary, the original Queen Mary, was built, Cunard thought that the ship was going to be so big and so stable, she didn't need handrails in the passenger corridors. Well, on one of the early trips, there was such a bad storm, so many people were injured and hospitalised that they had to retrofit handrails. And in fact, one of the passengers was a young writer who went on to write a book called The Poseidon Adventure. And it's from his experience of being on the Queen Mary that used to roll over 40 degrees each way. With modern stabilisers, Queen Mary 2 doesn't roll more than 3 degrees. And even that, we begin to say, it's getting too much. But you imagine 40 degrees. And so, yes, he devised the Poseidon Adventure.
So, can you explain how Queen Mary 2 is not a cruise ship? Because some people would make the mistake of calling her a cruise ship.
Grave mistake.
Yes.
Because Queen Mary 2 is the only ocean liner in the world now that's still sailing. And it's a combination of the thickness of the hull, the strength, the shape of the hull. You look at a modern cruise ship at the front and it's sort of like this. In order to get as much volume, as many cabins as you can on board, Queen Mary 2 is like an arrow. It's the power. We've got 120 megawatts of power, which is enough power for the whole of Southampton and the surrounding area when we need it. We don't always need the whole lot, but when the Atlantic kicks up really rough, you need that power to maintain passage through. It's a pyramid shape. Modern cruise ships, you push the superstructure right to the front, you push it right to the back, and you overstress the bow and the stern because there's no buoyancy at the bow and the stern. But by having all this weight up front, if you get into high waves, you find the ship's bending and twisting and you get cracks. Queen Mary 2, the weight is in the centre of the ship where it's supported by the buoyancy so you don't get the cracking and everything else. All these things added together equate to a 40% increase in the cost to build the ship and a 40% increase in operating because of lost revenue and the extra fuel you need and things like that. So the big problem with Queen Mary 2 was getting around that 40% premium, because Mickey Harrison said, we can have the liner, but you've got to design a ship that will circumvent that 40% premium compared to our cruise ships. Otherwise, we forget about the Atlantic and we just go cruising.
So a lot of people don't realise, but cruise ships have to go and hide when it gets to autumn and winter. Queen Mary 2 doesn't have to do that, does she?
No, and in fact, many years ago there was a hurricane that approached New York, closed New York Harbour. Every other ship was confined to port. Queen Mary 2 sailed, and she sailed out into the teeth of the hurricane, and no problem whatsoever.
On one of her early voyages, I remember you telling me that the captain asked you to come onto the bridge, and he pointed at the radar and showed you something, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. There's two things I'd like to mention here. On the maiden voyage, maiden transatlantic, she encountered two storms, and I was in my office in London, and Commodore Warwick rang me, and he said, I've never experienced a storm like this. He said, we've got to reach New York on time to meet up with QE2 because of all the publicity that's been arranged, but I'm worried about pressing on at this high speed. And he had to do about 26, 27 knots in this great big storm. And he said, what should I do? And I said, look, Ron, it's what the ship's designed for. Just go for it. And he said, it's all very well for you sitting in London telling me that. But he did. And she reached New York on time without any problem. 2008, I was on board on a summer transatlantic, and very unusually, a huge storm developed out of nowhere, typical Atlantic, Western Ocean. And it was a 600-mile storm front, force 12, 120-knot winds, and we were doing 23 knots in that. And I was up in the library, which is the forwardmost public space, signing autographs and things like that. Okay, there were some people that were ill, but the vast majority of the passengers were fine. The ship was operating perfectly, and it's what she's designed for.
But the radar...
Oh, yeah, we're with this great storm. I was brought up, and they said, look, you can see other ships out here that are stopped going backwards because of the storm, and yet we're going across. And he said, we get messages saying, how are you able to do this when we're not? And he said the greatest pleasure that they have in replying to these other ships is that we're the Queen Mary 2. What else would you have expected?
Well said. So, her being a transatlantic liner, why is the layout so different to a cruise ship? Because I'm a big fan of Queen Mary 2, like it a lot, but the layout is very confusing. And on cruise ships, you tend to find things all in the same locations. But on Queen Mary 2, it's a bit different. Like, you've got a buffet restaurant on the promenade deck, which is quite unusual. So why is that?
Queen Mary 2's layout is driven entirely because she's a transatlantic liner. And let's clear up the buffet on deck 7. Why is that there? Why isn't it at the top of the ship? Basically, I needed a refuge to act as a muster station where I could bring the passengers and not have them out on the open deck. If I'd put cabins there, then it would have meant we would have had to have mustered on the open deck. And in a North Atlantic situation with the wind and the weather, I didn't want that. So to me, the Lido restaurant, King's Court as it's called, had to be on that deck 7 location. Now, various other things are very strange on board, and I admit that. And again, it's a function of the ship. The dining room, the main dining room, Britannia, is 2/3 aft, but it's actually at the pivot point of the ship's motion, because I felt in a rough transatlantic crossing, I wanted the dining room to feel the most comfortable area. And of course, ahead of it, you've got the Golden Lion pub and the chart room on the different levels. But there was the need to have another bar behind so that you could feed the restaurant from both ends, like after a cocktail party and things like that. And that's why the Queen's room is actually behind the Britannia restaurant. Now, the big challenge, of course, is that you've got to get access to this Queen's room. Do you have people going through the dining room? Well, what we came up with, because the 2 decks that the dining room is located on are so high, they're 4.5 metres instead of 3.8, which is the normal height on a passenger ship. Because of that extra height, we were able to put through the middle of the dining room, between the levels, a hidden access corridor.
Gallery.
Which one side is the art gallery, the other side was originally the photo gallery, but that's now been converted into additional cabins. But that was a way to try and prevent people having to go through the dining room.
Oh, they go through.
Oh, I know
They do.
But
Every time.
one thing I must say is that there's no such thing as a perfect ship. The ship is a compromise. The ship's never big enough to do everything you would like to do and the like. And, of course, there's the economic thing you have to think about as well. So there's no perfect ship. Queen Mary 2 isn't perfect, but she is as near perfect as I was able to make her.
Queen Mary 2 actually makes people quite tribal, particularly on Facebook groups. There's people on there, they will not hear bad words said about Queen Mary 2. So listening to the naval architect say she's not a perfect ship, next time someone makes out that she is,
Actually, point them to this. Talking of not a perfect ship, so is there any aspect of Queen Mary 2 that you're not pleased with? Or that you would have changed?
Well, hindsight is a big thing. And, of course, we have 4 diesel engines and 2 gas turbines, which at the time she was designed and built appeared to be the optimum solution to give us the high speed that they wanted to operate the ship. The high price of the gas turbine fuel makes using those turbines problematic because of the cost. But I think with environmental regulations becoming tighter, it may be that if we moved over, say, to green methanol, something like that, it could well be that those turbines could run on that. And if green methanol becomes widely available and equivalent cost to like diesel fuel, maybe, then they'll be very, very useful there. The other 2 other aspects. One is just in front of the mast, there's a lookout area, which I put there specifically because the QE2's area, just below the bridge on QE2, you couldn't go up there when the ship was at sea because it was so windy. So I wanted a space that passengers could normally access and it would be protected. But I really wanted to be able to see the tip of the bow, so you had that perspective. Because of the air conditioning room that's on top of the bridge, it rather blocks the view of the bow. So that would be a slight redesign. And then the other thing, I was very conscious and being driven by my heritage from Carnival, what to do on Queen Mary 2. And the captain's cabin, although it's the largest cruise cabin on board, does come for some criticism. Some of the captains who I'm great friends with will playfully tell me that it's bad. Others, their wives won't talk to me at all because they say it's so bad. But they would like a bigger cabin. And certainly in the days of QE2, what was really nice and special with QE2 is that there would be cocktail parties in the officers' cabins. And I remember many times being invited, and you'd have 4 or 5 invites for the same night. And so rather than going on a pub crawl, you'd go on a senior officer crawl. They don't do that anymore, sadly. It's all done in a big lounge, and that's lost that. But certainly you wouldn't be able to do that comfortably with the size of the cabin that's on Queen Mary 2. So,
is there any other lesser-known aspects about Queen Mary 2 that people might not know about that you could say?
Well, there are a few fun things, like the mast itself has a gaff, a short mast where we fly the red ensign. When the ship's in port, invariably the house flag, Cunard flag, and the courtesy flag of the country that we're visiting, if the wind conditions are low, they flop down and droop. But something that's consistent, and I deemed it to be very important, because this ship, after all, is the flagship of the British Merchant Marine, I didn't want the red ensign ever to be limp. And so it's on that gaff with the air conditioning exhaust blowing on it, so that it's always fluttering and always proudly saying, I'm the flagship of Great Britain.
Brilliant.
Engineer's brain.
Only you could think of that.
But one other interesting that I was asked quite recently, actually, the windscreens around the stern. You've got the glass bits, and then above you've got the structure. But there are these strange cutouts, and they're all different ovoids. Some are circles, some are ovoids. And people have said, what were you smoking when you drew that out? I didn't actually design that. I must admit, it was the shipyard. But they're individually designed with resonance in mind. So underneath, you've obviously got the 4 propellers and creating a tremendous amount of vibrational energy into the structure. QE2's windscreens would be vibrating madly. Queen Mary's don't, because they've been tuned with those holes changing the resonance frequency.
Wow.
Amazing.
Queen Mary 2 is celebrated for her grandeur and engineering excellence. Can you describe the moment you first saw her in a completed state?
Well, rather than completed state, because that all... It's a madhouse building a ship. And it's only in the last week of construction that it all comes together, and you get what you see as you go on board now. Before that, it's a mass of cables and stuff on the ground, an absolute disaster. But for me, the most momentous time was in March of 2003, when the ship floated as a complete unit for the first time and was taken out from the construction dock round to the outfitting quay. And it was done in the middle of the night, and the shipyard had erected on board temporary generators, and they'd fitted lights around the ship. It was a dead ship, basically, but they fitted this, and almost all the shipyard workers came out, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning in March, so cold, we're all standing, and the ship was pulled out, and it was slightly foggy, and you got this absolutely amazing image of this ship, and it really was a foretaste of what it was going to be. Yeah. And that for me was a tremendous, tremendous moment. And then going off on the first sea trials, we had a tremendous relationship with the French, got on really well with them. On occasion they would stand their ground as I would stand mine, but it was a real working relationship, unlike the relationship they had with some of the other owners. But on that first sea trial, to see all these people crying as the ship moved for the first time, really brought home to me that they really were proud to be building the ship and be part of it. And they absolutely saw that this was something well different and beyond what they had built before in that yard.
We've touched on before about you saying that ocean liner design in the past influenced how you designed Queen Mary 2. In the past, a lot of ocean liners had more than one funnel. Was there ever a plan for Queen Mary 2 to have more than one funnel?
Not from me. I always wanted to have the single funnel. I wanted to model it as I wanted the mast and the bridge front to be modelled on QE2s, so there was a family resemblance. The big problem with Queen Mary 2 is to get under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and so that the funnel had to be rather stumpy. And because of that, to make it work effectively, the skirt that's around it, which is a wind scoop, had to be much more exaggerated than on QE2. And my concern was that if we'd have had dummy funnels on the deck, and it would have been likely that the working funnel would have been the middle one, if we had had a dummy funnel forward and aft, the flow of air around the upper decks would have been completely changed and would have really compromised the working of the real funnel. Plus, it would have added a lot of extra weight to the ship, and it would taken up deck space. Now, Carnival's interior architect, Joe Farkas, who actually designed the funnel for the Carnival ships, he proposed to Mickey Harrison that the ship should have 3 funnels, and actually did a sketch. And I'm laughing because there was a lot of aggro over it. There was a move to investigate whether or not it could be done. And when I got wind of this was even being considered, I went ballistic, and I demanded a meeting with Mickey. And he was actually flying into Manchester for a board meeting with Air Tours. And he said, with his vice chairman, Howard Frank, he said, I'll give you 30 minutes to put your case and I'll make my decision. So I absolutely, full force, went in and, crazy idea and this and that. And at the end, Howard said to me, Stephen, do I take it you don't want 3 funnels? And I was taken to one side by my line manager, and he said, you were very aggressive there. And he said, I've apologised to Mickey on your behalf for getting so animated and everything. And he said, Mickey just said, no, he sort of believes in what he's saying, and that's it. So I was determined that there wouldn't be anything false or fake on Queen Mary 2. And in fact, the only area where I've allowed that to happen was the black lines across the superstructure front that represent the walkways from the old Queen Mary. And the reason is I felt that the big expanse of superstructure without it being broken up just doesn't look right. No. And so having those lines just add something, and that's the only faux or fake thing on Queen Mary 2.
Yeah, and I think that's right, because I know you get cars nowadays and they've literally got faux exhausts, haven't they? And they just look ridiculous. Yeah. I don't know what's going on with German car manufacturers at the moment, but they're a bit obsessed with putting these fake exhausts on. But yeah, I think keeping it real, I think it adds to why Queen Mary 2 is special.
How long do you think Queen Mary 2 will be around for? How much life has she got left in her?
Well, she's the first ship in the industry that we had a fatigue calculation and put that as part of the specification, that structurally she should last 40 years without major intervention. Now, a lot of the cruise ships are constantly having cracks and remedial work. Queen Mary has not had to have any of that. I worked very closely with Lloyd Register on the structural design, and there were no compromises. Several places like the Royal Court Theatre, the big theatre, low down in the ship, the interior architects wanted to remove some of the pillars to improve the sight lines, which I can understand. But this is in a crucial forward part of the ship that's going to be stressed the most from the wave impacts and things like that. And then you've got the rest of the ship above, and I wouldn't let them remove the pillars. And I know there's criticisms about the sight lines occasionally, but I'd much rather have those criticisms than not have the lounge at all.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
What are you most proud of about Queen Mary 2?
Well, it's the egalitarian aspect, because the old queens, Elizabeth and Mary, had 3 classes, which were quite disparate. QE2 was designed as a 3-class ship, entered service with 2, and ended up with 1, but that had the legacy of staircases in odd places, serving different classes that in the end no longer existed. But on Queen Mary 2, all the cabins are en suite. The cheapest cabin occupants get to eat in the Britannia restaurant, which I think is the most wonderful restaurant at sea, the way it looks. And so it brings, I think, a first-class experience. The ship of state, which the old queens were, and the Normandy and that, it brings that to everybody who's on Queen Mary 2, and I think that's the thing I'm most proud of.
Amazing. So Queen Mary 2, again, is a famous ship, so she has attracted celebrities, notable figures. Have you met anyone on board that's...
There's always a sprinkling of people. I'm not one to sort of go up and... but I know President Bush Sr. used to enjoy travelling on board. Didn't like flying, but I've met a number of the royals. They haven't actually sailed with the ship, but I arrived one day at my office in Saint Nazaire to be told by the yard, actually, that we've cancelled your engagements for the day because you've got a special guest, wants to be shown around, and it was Prince Edward. And I must say, I had a marvellous day talking to him. Gave me a completely different perspective as to how I imagined Prince Edward would be. Perfect gentleman. Thoroughly enjoyed time with that. And then through various things, president of my institute and the like, I got to know and meet Prince Philip a number of times. And that was always a magical experience.
Yes, I bet it was.
I bet.
Meeting him. And he was such a lot of fun. And he actually came and visited the ship in 2014 to mark the 10-year anniversary, and asked me to do the route so he could meet some of the crew and stuff like that. And then it was known that in fact it would be a private tour and that I wouldn't be present during the tour. And I must admit, he got very angry and he said, well, I'm not coming unless Mr. Payne shows me around. So I got invited to it. So,
You know, you.
Yeah.
Could you explain whether there is a need or a significance in maintaining the history, the heritage, and the traditions of Cunard, or whether, as a line, she needs to evolve with the times?
Well, everything needs to evolve. It's how far you do that. But something that Queen Mary II does rests very heavily on the past. You've got the artwork and the heritage trail around the ship. And I think for the transatlantic liner, she's the only ship in the world that does that now. To fill her up, people want to experience that classic Cunard ship of state type voyage. And so it's essential for Queen Mary 2, I think, to follow the lead of QE2 and have that heritage and that. And I remember when Cunard was actually purchased by Carnival, there was a lot of dissent within the industry with people saying, Cunard's going to be funnelized and everything that Carnival was known for. And Mickey made it very, very plain. He said, we are custodians of this big brand, and we're not going to sacrifice that by changing it.
Queen Anne is a little bit more like other Carnival brands, though, isn't it?
She is, but she's the more modern interpretation of it. Yeah, most certainly. But as I say, it is evolving.
Yeah. Do you think there'll ever be another ocean liner, or do you think Queen Mary 2 will be the last one?
It's very unusual when you're sailing on Queen Mary 2 transatlantic that there's any empty cabins. So at the moment, the ship is sailing full most of the time. If they can maintain that, and if they're making a sizable profit from doing it, then there's obviously the need for it.
Mm.
The important thing is that in the future, whoever makes that decision decides that the ship that's going to take over from Queen Mary 2 has got to be the liner and not the cruise ship, if they're going to operate her like they do Queen Mary 2. And in fact, when I first had discussions with Mickey and Howard Frank about Queen Mary 2, and we were looking at like the Disney ships that had just been built, and you've got the black hull, the white superstructure, red and black funnels.
Blue funnels, yeah.
Looks like a liner. And I said, let me show you a picture of what happens on the Atlantic, which you have to be mindful of. And I showed the incident of the Michelangelo in 1966, where a large wave engulfed the forward part of the ship, ripped the ship open, and people were swept overboard and drowned. And I said, that's what will happen on a cruise ship being pushed in rough weather to maintain a schedule. And with Queen Mary 2, she is designed and built and absolutely optimized for sailing in those rough weather conditions without compromise. And she's done it many a times and comes through completely unscathed. With a cruise ship, you would have to slow down or alter course, and that you don't have to do with a proper liner.
Regarding cruise ships and safety, do you think they're getting too big?
As a passenger, personal, I would not want to go on one of these mega huge ships, because it's just, for me, like being in an airport lounge rather than being on a ship, the more traditional. Obviously, with so many people on board, you've got to satisfy evacuation requirements of getting everybody off in 30 minutes and the like. I would hate to be in a situation where you've got 7,000 people that have got to be evacuated from one of these big ships in bad weather. Absolutely.
Lastly, what personal impact has working on Queen Mary 2 had on you, and how has it influenced your approach to any future projects?
Well, Queen Mary 2, the first ocean liner to be built for 30 odd years, since QE2 had been built, so the first ship of its type. First time that we'd built a ship with Cunard that we'd just bought a few months previously. The first contract that we'd done with Saint-Nazaire, Chantier de l'Antique. So there were lots of things there, and it was important to make it work for everybody. And I think the thing that I learned from it is perhaps working with a diverse group of people and trying to give them the encouragement to do things and excel themselves, where a great range of people did extraordinary things to make Queen Mary 2 a big success. You know, just for example, at the forward front of the ship, the rules and the British Coast Guard originally said every window has got to have a great big storm shutter that we want you to be able to fit from the outside. Well, it would have meant we would have had to have catwalks all around the forward part of the superstructure, and we said, you're not physically going to be able to, a man is not going to be able to lift one of these storm shutters in place. So we worked with the yard and with the authorities to get an equivalence where the thickness of the glass is now the thickness that we would normally have, plus the equivalent of having the steel shutter permanently in place. And it's working through problems like that and having the shipyard willing to spend time on that, to do that, which they did for this project. So it's coercing, a bit of manipulation, that was a large part of it to get what I felt the ship needed. But the experience of working with people, and certainly, you know, the big thing that I want to do in the future is to get this a national flagship.
And we're going to do another podcast on that at some point.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very exciting. In the meantime, thanks again.
Thank you very much
for your time. And yeah, it's been, as always, fascinating talking to you.
No, well, thank you very much.